Alright, today we're going to be working on estimating percents. This is lesson 2 of chapter 2. These are the ones that I find the most useful. If you look at this is 100 little squares inside this box. 25% of them are pink. That's a really nice one to know. It's 1/4 as a fraction. In the green there is 50%. That's 1/2 as a fraction. Over to the right in red, that's 10%, which is 1/10 as a fraction. And then the little blue one in the middle is 1%, which is, well, 1/100th as a fraction. So those are some ones that we kind of want to look at, and we want to use those to estimate. So we're just going to try a couple numbers before we do this. So if I gave you the number 42, and we were wanting to estimate, one thing you might do is you might look at a number that's a little bit nicer close to 42, like maybe 40. Alright, we're going to use 40, and we're just going to go with those basic ones that we just talked about and kind of find those individual ones. Alright, so let's go with probably the easiest one for most people right away is 50%. If I want to find 50% of 40, now we've talked about how we could write that. We could do that as 50%. Well, I can write 50 as 100 of means time, so 50% times 40, or you could write 50% as a decimal, 0.5 times 40. That's one way to solve it. But if we're wanting to do this kind of with estimation, what is 50% of 40? Well, 50% we know is half, so what's half of 40? 20. So we'd be looking somewhere around 20. Okay, let's go to another one that's pretty easy, and that's 25%. One thing that you notice is it's pretty easy to get half, and guess what a fourth is? It's a half of a half. So if you can find a half and then cut it in half, you're at 25%. So half of 20 is 10. That would be your 25%. So I've already kind of estimated 50%. Now I've estimated 25%. Now the two remaining ones are by far the easiest once you learn them. So I'm going to write down that 40 again. I'm going to show you how to get 10% quickly. 10% is 1/10. And by the way, if you remember that, if I'm going to write 1/10 as a decimal or as a fraction, I'll write it like that. If I were going to do the math, remember, you're always going to be able to cross simplify here, and what you're really doing is dividing by 10 or chopping off those zeros. That makes that pretty easy to just find 4. Now you might notice that 4 and 40 have something in common. All you needed to do was take that decimal, which was right there if you couldn't see it, and when you divide by 10, you're moving it one place, and now 4 is 10% of 40. 4 is 10% of 40. Well, it's a very similar process for 1%. So if I want to find 1%, once again, I could write it as 1/100. Take it times that 40. You might notice now you're doing that, but you're also going to be able to do another simplification here diagonally. But we'll just show you that quickly. Here's your 40. 10% of 40, remember, was moving the decimal once by dividing by 10. You need to divide it twice, so you're going to be moving it over to 0.4, and 0.4 is 1%. So 0.4 is our 1%. We found that 4 was our 10%. We have our 25% and our 50%, and those can lead you to things like 75%, which would just be 50% plus 20%, or 25%, which would be then 30. But that's an easy way to look at that. Okay, so let's try one from the book now. All right. Number 1 on Guide to Practice of page 114 is 52% of 10. 52% of 10. Once again, we could still do the math problem as far as I can write it as a decimal. We could write it as a fraction. But we're wanting to estimate. So once again, 52% is really close to 50%. So if I wanted to find 50% of 10, we'd be looking at, once again, half of 10, which is 5. All right? So to estimate it, we could quickly get that at 5. The next one is 79% of 489. 79% of 489. Well, 79% you might notice is not a pretty one like we dealt with. It didn't round any of those nice ones. We could find 75% pretty easily because we did that with 50% and a 25%, so add those together. So we could do it like that. Let me do it that way. 489 I would probably estimate to be about 500. Now I'm going to find 50% of it by taking half of that. So 50% would be 250. Find another 25%. Well, 25% is half of that one, half of the 50%, so that'd be 125. So I would know that 75% would be really close to 375. Okay. That's a decent estimate, not exactly as close as I would like. So, you know, what we could have done is I could have found out what 10% was. So let me do that. What's 10%? Remember, let's move the decimal 2 places. So, or excuse me, 1 place. 1 would be 50. And then if I want to go to 80%, 80% is just 8 of those 10%, isn't it? So if I took that 50 times 8, I'd be at 400. Now we have 2 different estimates according to how we estimated it. This one would be roughly 75%. This would be roughly 80%. We have several, but once again, we're just trying to get a rough estimate here. All right, I'm going to skip to number 4, and we're going to do that one. That is 0.5% of 82. And these always make people struggle. I shouldn't say they make people struggle. People struggle at them because they don't really understand what a 0.5% is. Remember, if I go back to my picture, 1% is that little blue square, 1/100th. So really what I'm saying when I say a 0.5% is I only have half of one blue square. So I could do that quickly by finding half. If I wanted to round it, I could round 82 to 80 and find out a 0.5% by finding a percent. Remember, percent is moving the decimal 2 times. So I'm moving it to 0.8. So 0.8 is roughly 1%, but I want to cut that in half because now I want half of that 1%. Divide that by 2 and you're going to be at 0.4. So 0.4 is roughly a 0.5% of 82.